So before we start, has anyone got any comments that they make or things that they've been thinking about or coming up against or any of that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I do.
Yep.
So I think last time we talked about the Vedanta being sort of an old-fashioned way to relate to God, sort of, and that and so when we talked about this, I'm willing, but I can't just jump into it. I need little steps in between to get there.
What do you mean? What, I don't remember saying it was old-fashioned. I don't quite. Sorry, could you?
Oh, yeah, that was like you said. Well, this is sort of an old-fashioned way of doing things, like a total trust in God, and.
Oh yeah. I was talking about it. There's a sort of a universal truth that keeps on appearing or reappearing within all of the great traditions. Yeah.
Yes. And so I go, okay, I'm willing, and I want to do it, although I need little steps to actually get there. I can't just jump into it.
Well, in one sense that's true, in another it's not. Can I go into that?
Yes, please.
Okay. We first of all have an understanding of what God is, and based on that understanding, what we're doing is we're gaining more and more clarity about what God is. Clarity, which is, so it's not, see, in functional life, I want to go from here to there. Is that true? So it's in space and it takes time. In space and takes time, right?
Yeah.
So what happens is, could a process that is time bound and limited by space,
I know where you're going.
can it approach the timeless?
I knew you were going to say that.
I knew you knew that you were going to say that, because I've said it so many times before. So yeah, it's just a fact that what happens is we think that with our doing and our thinking we can get somewhere. Now I remember a story once that a priest told, and he was visiting a young person in hospital who was dying. And this young person said, I've been trying to find God. I just can't find God, whatever. And the priest said to him, you need to let God find you. Right? And at the time, I didn't necessarily understand that. I've heard that when I was about 30, which was a long time ago. All right. So I think what we'll do is, you see, in these talks, we only talk about one thing, really. If you notice that, we just talk about the same thing. The thing with all of us as human beings is that we have the fourth striving, the fourth Vedic striving, which in our Western tradition was made famous by St. Augustine, who said, my heart is restless until I rest in thee. And so we have a longing to be at home. We feel like we're a stranger in a strange land. Do you know what I mean? Like, as human beings, we don't feel at home in this world as it is. And it's interesting how Christ talked about there is this world and says, my kingdom is not of this world. It's an interesting way of putting it. So, but what Dayananda talks about is a journey without distance. That means no time and space, right? So that means that the very start, and he asked me to address the students before I left, and I said this in front of him, and he gave it his imprimatur, if you like, right? So Vedanta starts right here, right now, as you are, and it ends right here, right now, as you are. The problem is it starts with the problem. That's what we don't like. Okay, because he says, Swami Dayananda says, the problem is with you and the solution is with you. Now, this creates a tremendous difficulty for a lot of people because of the non-recognition of the location of the problem, because we're so used to dealing with our unhappiness through our thinking and our actions, because we assign the unhappiness, I'm unhappy because of some object away from us. So we're fairly hardwired to believe that our problems are external to us. It's my suffering. The reason for my suffering is my wife. The reason for my suffering is my physical health. The reason for my suffering is the circumstances I'm in. The reason for my suffering is what thoughts and feelings come into my mind. So are you all familiar with blaming or feeling that you're victimized by some object other than you? Who's ever experienced victimization of some object other than you? Normal, isn't it? It's the way it works. But what Swami Dayananda basically says is that in the Vedanta vision, the location of the problem is me, is me. Now, this is extremely important, because where the problem is resolved is the same place where the problem is, which is a great thing, actually, because if our problem, if our suffering, if the meaning, you see, from Vedanta's point of view, the meaning of our suffering is our believing that we have a life and being separate and apart from God. Who's ever had that experience of feeling like you've got your own life separate and apart from other people, the world, and God? Who's ever had that feeling? That's the fundamental problem. That's the fundamental meaning of our suffering, actually, right? But we're caught in the idea that we're having meaning. So we need to, in order to understand the practice, we need to first of all have an understanding of God, right? And this is an important thing to understand. Well, what do we mean by God? And like what Dayananda says, he said, we don't ask why God is there, or why the world. We ask, what is God? What is God? Okay. And for the Hindus, they have for the Buddhists, for example, they talk about this cosmic wisdom compassion that embraces everything. The Hindus have a way of talking about God, and they talk about God as what they call Sat Chitananda. I'm sure you've all heard of that, right? But let's just have a look at Sat Chitananda in a very practical, existential way. So first of all, we have this, when we are cut off and alienated from the presence of reality, we're enclosed in our psychophysical functions. In other words, we take our life and being to be what we're seeing with our senses, our thinking about what's happening, and our emotional reactions about what's happening. Does that make sense? This normally constitutes what we mean. We call this my life. But for Vedanta, my life is actually the life that God is. So that God actually is my life. That's in our Western scriptures, we say our Father and I are one. Have you heard of that one from our Western scriptures? So there's a non-duality suggested that the very life we are, the life that we really are is God. Okay? Or you could say that God gives us his life as our life. But what the important point is that life, which is not away from the presence of God, so life is not what we think it is. We think it is this happenings. In other words, time-bound spatial activity. We think that's our life. And so first of all, real life, the true and the real, is what God is. God is true and real. In other words, the substance of everything. All right. And the way that Dayananda puts that, if you've got a clay pot and a clay play and a clay jug, even though all the forms are different, the substance there's one substance called clay. That's one of their teaching devices of how they bring us to an understanding that the presence of God, and they say that God is the material cause of the universe. It's interesting how he uses an Aristotelian term for that, but anyway, it's the material cause of the universe. So that means, and he said the starting point of Vedanta is an understanding that God is the material cause of the universe. Do you know that he said that? And why would he say that? Because that means when you're looking at a clay pot, even if it was an ugly clay, even if it was an ugly pot, is every aspect of that pot pervaded by clay? Every aspect. What about when you're looking at an ocean and you got, smooth waves and rough waves and violently heavy waves and smooth, placid water? No matter what the form, which is constantly changing in the ocean, have we got one substance called water that's abidingly present and pervades every aspect of the form? Now, this becomes very practical in the sense that means the presence of the form wave is the presence of God. In other words, is the presence of water. That means from our angle that the presence of God is absolutely not away from anything. So the presence of reality, the living presence of reality, is continually embracing every aspect of my experience in the form of what he calls the given. But the given often is not seen because I'm only seeing the given because it's there, I see it. But if I'm looking at a snake instead of a rope, I'm caught up in subjectivity because I'm seeing it, it's there. And he made a very interesting saying. He said, in subjectivity, not even God can help you. Right? But he also said a very interesting thing. He says the only thing we can give God is our subjectivity. Now, isn't it interesting? The only thing we can give God. So in other words, we can only give what we take to be our life. All right? So we have this understanding of God, that the very presence of reality. Now, this is a very practical thing, actually. If you think about it, are you always in a situation where the presence of reality is in a particular form? Is that always there? Do you produce the presence of reality? Now, if it's immediately here, can you get to it? If it's already here, it's completely present, it's embracing you, can you get to it? In other words, through time and space, can you arrive at it?
Well, you can more deeply appreciate it.
Oh, that's good. I'm not talking about that. Right, that's true. Because it's a journey without distance. So you can abide in the appreciation of the presence of reality through knowledge. If you understand what Swami Dayananda means by God. But you can't get there. Do you see what I mean? Like that young boy who was struggling, I want to find God.
You can only more deeply appreciate that you're there already.
That God is here already. Yeah. God is embracing you. Yeah. Okay. So that's the first aspect of Sat. That the primary thing is the very presence of reality is abidingly present and all pervasive, and pervades every aspect of your experience. And this means, and this understanding changed my life, and it's the understanding that I've had that I've been learning about for the last 5 or 6 years. That the very presence of the given, the living presence of the given, the presence of the computer, the presence of your faces, the presence of the light, the presence of my books, the presence of the table, the very presence of what is here is God. The presence of the given is the presence of the giver. Okay? So for the Hindus, they don't have this idea that we're in the world here and God is somewhere over there. Okay? For the Hindus, God is not away from us. We don't have to that, but we're cognitively cut off from God, not ontologically. Now, some Catholic mystics or theologians would agree, some wouldn't. But our problem is not that we're actually cut off from God, but we're cognitively cut off from God. In other words, our problem is we're ignorant of God's presence. We're ignorant of God's presence. Now, if it's true that we're ignorant of God's presence, what is the solution to that? Knowledge of God's presence. Now, this is where Dayananda has what he might call it that. This is why Dayananda brought an epistemological method. In other words, he said this profound saying. He said, you can only be aware of what you know. Now, so if I know what God is, I can then be aware of him. But if I don't know that he's the material cause of the universe, then I won't be able to be aware of that fact, because he's not talking about it as a philosophical or a religious or theological notion. He's talking about a fact that we can open our eyes to and become aware of. Does that make sense? And he calls that recognition of what God is knowledge. Are we all clear so far? So he says that we first of all have to knowledge, then we have to live the knowledge. Now, one of the most primary datums is that everything is. The computer is. The cup is. Bit of another one of those. My coffee is.
Cheers.
Okay. People are is. What we always say the word is, don't we? Now, it's very interesting in our Western tradition, St. Thomas Aquinas said that God is the fullness of is. In other words, anything is a composition of the fact of existing, having being, and the determinate kind of being. I'm a being, and I'm a human being, right? And so so Aquinas says that we borrow existence from God, because God is existence itself, being itself. So Aquinas, he didn't use the word material cause of the universe, but it's just I found it very interesting how they converged, right? So we have the fact that, you just pause for it, and I want you just to pause for a minute, and all I want you to do for 30 seconds is try not to be aware of the presence of reality in any particular form. Okay, I just want you to try not to be aware of one. Just try not to be aware of it, of the presence of what's here, in the form of thoughts, chairs, cups, whatever. Try not to be aware of it. How are you going? Okay. So, also, did you notice that when you are filled up with the presence of reality, you appreciated yourself as conscious? So that when the presence of the given occupies your mind, in other words, it's full of objects, you're objective, you're being objective, because it's there, you're seeing it. That very presence taking up of the reality, taking up all the room in your mind, makes you conscious, doesn't it? You don't make yourself conscious. All right, we clear on that so far? And what's interesting is that the Hindus say that Sat is Chit. It is. If you come into direct contact with the living presence of the given, anything, you will find that you become conscious, because Sat is Chit. The very presence of something, the presence is light. So not only is God life, but God is light. God is that which illuminates everything. God is constantly revealing us to ourselves. Have you noticed that? You know, when you do something bad and you don't like it, but it's just the light of awareness is just showing you that you've been acting like a bloody idiot. And you might not like it, but it's revealing, it reveals what's here. Have you noticed that? So it's only in the light of awareness, which is abidingly present, do we see. Now, this light of awareness, this all-pervasive light of awareness, in which everything is, do you create that? Is it an ego function? Is it my awareness? Do I have to kind of keep it up? Do I have to maintain it? Or is it just there? Are we all clear on this so far? So we have...
Bede, is the answer to that yes and no?
No. Not at all.
Okay.
Awareness is not the result of any of my psychophysical functions.
Well, we're saying that our existential appreciation of what we are.
I'm not talking about what we are actually. At the moment, Bob, I'm only talking about what God is.
Oh, good point.
Oh yeah, I said to Bob, we're not talking about you, right? We're talking about what God is. Because maybe in the understanding of what God is, what you are will look after itself, Bob. Okay? Maybe it's only when you see, for Swami Dayananda, there's a distinction, it's a distinction between ourselves as personality and ourselves as a simple conscious person. We only become a simple conscious person in our own eyes when we come into relationship to the presence of reality. It's only when we're in relationship to the presence of reality do we become conscious. Okay, so as soon as we become conscious of the presence of God, the presence of reality, we come into relationship, we become alive to facts, we become a simple conscious person. Now, ourselves.
In order for that to obtain, don't we have to stop? We have to stop doing what we've been doing all along.
Well, not quite. I'm going to say that. No, it's actually not. No, what happens is that's going to cause you a lot of problems, Bob, because you're going to try and get there. You're going to try and become attentive and all that stuff. You'll notice that when the presence of reality comes alive in you, at that precise moment you become conscious. Okay, normally we're not aware of the presence of reality. We're enclosed in our psychophysical activity. We're caught in.
That's the point, Bede. That's where we are. Many of us are. That's where we start.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
That's where we are.
Right. That's where we are. Now, but if you notice, have you ever been walking down the road, Bob, caught up in imagination, then suddenly you become aware? Have you ever had that happen to you?
Yeah.
Did you turn that awareness on, or did simply the presence of reality come in one sense, scoop you up and draw you to itself away from your identification as an imaginer?
That's true. That's
so
true.
It's the action of God, not you, Bob. You're not special. You're nothing, Bob. Okay? Okay. All right.
How about that? I know I'm nothing.
When God gives you that,
Okay.
when God gives you that perception of your own nothingness, believe it or not, it's one of the greatest gifts He can ever give you. Okay, now, so we're back now. So are we all clear? We're always facing, and I'm going back to real grass tacks of Dayananda's understanding of God. So can you see? Just want you just for 30 seconds, just simply take note of the presence of reality and how the forms of it change, but the presence remains just abidingly present. So I just simply want you to take note of the coming, or simply take note of just simply what's coming and going for about 30 seconds. Just whatever comes, let God's presence express itself in you and whatever way it wants to do it. Okay, go. Now, Dayananda says a very interesting thing. You know what he says? He says, whoopsie daisy. I just hold a minute. I better get my. I didn't have my power plugged in. That would have been good, wouldn't it? Okay. Okay. Okay, so he said a very interesting thing. He says, the way to invite Isvarra into your life is to be aware of him. Now, is he thinking of being aware of some idea you've got in your head about some external object called God that maybe punishes you or does you favors sometimes? No. See, for Swami Dayananda, him means the living presence of reality, which is abidingly present with the rough waves and the smooth waves, the beautiful waves and the ugly waves. He would often say, when you're looking at the ocean, you can actually see that you're looking at water. That the perception of water doesn't depend upon the forms that are there. Now, this becomes very important when we come to self-acceptance, because who notices they can undergo during the day contours of experience, feeling pretty good, feeling a little bit low? Who's noticed that? Well, for Swami Dayananda, the contours of human experience are always embraced by God. Does that make sense? None of those experiences can take the presence of God away. None of our experiences can take the presence of God away. How good is that, by the way? How good is that, really? Right? Now, so here we are. We have the reality, the presence of reality. The presence of reality is also the light of reality, because Sat is Chit. They're not, you haven't got Sat and then you got Chit. Sat is Chit, Chit is Sat. Okay? So you have this life and light that is God, that is abidingly present, embracing you at all times. And also it doesn't withdraw its embrace just because you've done something stupid or wrong. That's important to know. You can't change the nature of God, which in our Western tradition, we have this notion by St. John, God is love, not has love. The very nature of God is love. So for Christianity, it's love. For the Buddhists, it's wisdom, compassion. For the Hindus, it's life, light, and fullness. We get to the third aspect, fullness Now, fullness is interesting. Limitlessness. Now, notice how in our minds, when we hear about limitlessness, we think it means gigantic and huge, don't we? It's not that. Okay? That's to do with, quantity is an aspect of matter, right? Limitless means without any limits. This means that there's nothing outside God. There's no place where God isn't. You see what I mean? If you heard that beautiful saying, Bob, I think I've mentioned it to you before, and you're Jewish and you should know it. You're standing on holy ground. I think it was Moses. We're always standing on holy ground. Are you with me? Have you ever heard the saying, the secret place of the Most High? As a place of refuge. So what we have is we have the presence of God, and if you don't like the word God, that's fine. Just use the presence of reality. I don't care. The presence of life. I don't care. When I talk to some of my psychotherapy clients, I don't talk about God. You can imagine. That probably would not work, depending on the person. But I can definitely say the presence of reality, because I don't. You see, with Swami Dayananda's thing, we're dealing with something you can see for yourself. Now, who noticed that when you were just simply quietly appreciating the presence of reality, you become conscious? Who noticed that? But you are conscious because you're filled with the presence of reality. Now, you're always filled with the presence of reality, but like with Bob's point, if you're not your appreciation of the presence of God can increase. Now, the way Dayananda put it is like a Kodak film. You might first of all get like an outline, and then no, was it Kodak film or another one? Would have been? Is it Kodak? I think it was a Kodak.
Polaroid.
What?
Polaroid.
A Polaroid. That's sorry. Yeah, I knew. I just okay. Getting old. So what happens is you're gaining more and more clarity. Whoever has ever sat in the morning, because I sit in the morning and it's dark and I'm just sitting there, and what happens is the dawn comes and the light comes, and as the light comes in, everything starts to come into detail, and everything's the same, but everything's different. Does that make sense? That's why the word deus, deity, whatever, it means light in Latin, daytime. Okay, so here we're talking about the presence of reality is abidingly present. It is constantly revealing to us our experience. In the light of this light of awareness, we see. Okay? In other words, in the presence of the light of awareness, we are given a new set of eyes. When we're caught up in personality, all we're looking at is projected interpretations. Are we all clear so far? So here we have this vision of God that Swami Dayananda opened for us. And this enables us to appreciate ourselves as a simple conscious being. Simple means no parts. That's Aquinas made a big deal about that. So when you're being a simple conscious being, there's no parts. And you find yourself simply being a conscious presence in the form of computers, tables, chairs, whatever, in the form of what is here. All right? You're rooted in reality. What Swami Dayananda says, you're rooted in God instead of being rooted in yourself. And he says that what you've got to do is there has to be less of you and more of Isvarra, which is translated in English, less of you and more of God. We all so far, we're tracking this so far. Now, so what's important? So you might think, well, what's the big deal? What's the big deal about God? Right? Okay, now God, for human happiness, right? Here we are, a stranger in a strange land. We know we're a stranger in a strange land. And we have this really peculiar longing for perfection or the absolute. This longing, we have a certain type of angst or a longing where we want to find rest. We want to be at home with ourselves. Now, here's what Dayananda says. You can't be at home with yourself unless you're at home in God. Okay, so this idea that I'm going to get myself together. Who's ever heard that saying? I'm going to get myself together. Right? You're not going to get yourself together. You might be able to improve function. But the only thing that lifts you out of the alienation, and you can be rooted in personality and you can do great things. You can build buildings, you can make scientific discoveries, all within personality. You could live a very successful, functional life. But that is not what we're talking about. That will not lead you home. It is only in your life, the only transformative factor in terms of your being is the appreciation of the presence of God and abiding in that appreciation. Are we all clear on that so far? Okay? So just quickly, what stands out to you? So you all get the significance of this Satchitananda, and I put it into English vernacular because I'm English and I'm an Anglo-Saxon, so that's what I do. So Kevin, tell me what stands out for you.
I think just the last sort of thing you said about where you cannot be at home in yourself without being in home in God.
Right.
Because I'm often involved with what you might call the Kevin project of feeling better in myself.
Mm-hmm. How does that work for you, Kevin?
I don't think it's ever worked.
No.
A distraction.
Yeah, it's a big distraction. Yeah, good. Smita.
Presence of the awareness is when you're aware of everything around you, and that fills you up, and that's how you can identify objects, and everything comes to be known. So it's the presence which it just engulfs you in its awareness, so that brings to light everything, and then that fills you up with appreciation of Isvarra. So,
yeah. God is always embracing you, Smita.
Yeah.
In your happinesses and in your sorrows.
Yeah.
Right?
And how would you connect that to as Satchitananda? Like, how would you?
Sat is life. Sat is life. When you're alive to facts, when you're rooted in God, you know how Dayananda says, but what is living?
Oh.
It's only when you're alive to facts are you living.
Yeah.
So the very presence of Isvarra gives you life. You participate in the life that is God when you are being when you appreciate the presence of God. You are appreciating your life in an entirely different way. You are given the life that is God as your life.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Real life, not all you think about yourself and all of what's happened to you and what your hopes are and all that stuff. That's not your life. Okay? We'll go into, but like, when you're sitting with yourself as you are, right? When you understand this vision of God, that's all you need to do. You are with yourself. So as soon as you are being yourself, in other words, when you're being sat, you're also being aware, you're also being full. That's the practical application, if you like.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah. Thank you.
Robert.
Yeah, I just, when you just now spoke, this this being yourself is such a, it's all depending on your sort of your understanding of what yourself refers to or what God refers to.
Yes, we only understand ourselves properly in the context of God, actually, not in the context of ourselves. Okay?
Yep.
Have you seen people who say, I'm such a Dayananda and all this stuff? Have you ever seen people go on about that stuff?
Well, not in that tone of voice.
No. No. Okay. They're making themselves into an object, actually. Anyway, okay. Notice also that when we're rooted in reality, we cease to be an object to ourselves. There's only the presence of being. There's not me being this that I can be happy about or sad about. There's just simply being. Yeah. Andre.
Dayananda's words that I can see only what I know. So the knowing.
Isn't it magnificent? What a brilliant principle.
Yeah. If I don't know what God is,
you can't be aware of God.
I can't be aware of God. Yeah, really.
No.
So I need the knowledge of God, and then I can see it.
Yes. So what he says, you've got two things. You've got the wisdom, which is the recognition of what is. Then you have, that's the wisdom, and then live the wisdom. In other words, when you're abiding in the appreciation of the presence of God, you're living the vision, aren't you? But it's a vision. It's not a doing. Very good, Andre. Michelle, you're the one that caused all this.
Thank you, Michelle.
All right, so I am realizing that I was looking for something that I already have and already am. That's what came to me today.
Yes, that it's an interesting thing in our Western scriptures. We talk about being a holy offspring of God. When we are being a simple conscious person, our sense of life and being is coming from God, from reality. It's not coming from our personal functions.
Yeah, and it's interesting that I actually feel a resistance to admitting to this. It's, yeah.
Well, that's just honest. We don't really want God in our life, actually. Because we want it. We also want to maintain our sense of identity because we're scared. We're very frightened of dying. In our Western tradition, St. Paul says we need to die daily. Not pleasant, but I'm going to go into that in a minute.
Okay.
Amelia.
Speak.
Speak to us. Yep.
No, I'm struck by the error in our thinking. It's just a shift in thinking, but of course we have to remember it.
Yes.
And certainly when we do, that fullness is there, that presence is there, and the mind, in fact, starts to quiet down.
Yes, but what happens is, no, it's more that you quieten down, actually, because you can actually be quiet even in the face of an erratic mind. That whole notion of the quiet mind business, when you are simply being aware, you are quiet. You might be aware of various thoughts and turbulations and fast-moving cars. That doesn't matter, because you are the one that's quiet. Okay, so there's a whole, Dayananda was brilliant about this, actually. Do you know what I mean? The very fact that that what we're doing is we're living the knowing. That in knowing God, we are ourselves. You'll find that when I'm knowing the presence of reality, I don't know it as a presence away from me, do I? I find myself being, don't I? Are you with me? So I'm not knowing. So what happens is when I'm being the aliveness to facts, I'm not being a this or a that, am I?
Yeah.
So what happens is I don't know God. God reveals himself and then I know God. Even Dayananda opening up what God is a revelation of God. The very fact that wisdom can obtain in me where I see what God is, that's the miracle, isn't it?
Yes.
That's grace. And that comes from what? Dayananda? No, it comes from God. Right, good. John.
The experience during these talks is of being embraced.
Yeah.
And in that embrace, I am fulfilled.
Yes, and in that embrace is the only place you find rest.
Ah, yes.
All right?
That's right, because at that moment, I don't have to strive for anything.
No. No. What happens when you're resting in the lap of Isvarra, there's three things that become evident. First of all, you feel composed. Even if you're really angry and upset, and if you remain with that, you're composed. You're together, aren't you? Right? You feel composed. You also understand what freedom is because you're no longer being determined by the presence or absence of objects.
Mm-hmm.
And you're freed from self-dissatisfaction because you're at home with yourself. The only thing that can resolve all the various forms of self-dissatisfaction is being at home with yourself, as yourself. And it's a very interesting thing what Swami Dayananda says is wisdom. He says that when you can remain with yourself as you are without any external supports, that is being wise. And then he joke, he says, we're normally otherwise. Right? But the thing is that if we're to understand his psychology, it's a tremendous accent on being. And in the West, we only know about doing and having. We think that if we can do and have, then we can be. Right? Now, so we don't really have a category of being in our Western tradition at all. We don't really talk about Sat. Now, if I can find it, I'll find it. There's a beautiful, it was from St. Augustine's notes on being, about returning to being. And if I find it, I'll read it to you next week. Right? Now, we get to a very interesting point here. Here we are, we're in personality, right? And we can feel so together in personality. We can feel a sense of self-satisfaction. Do you know what I mean? A sort of a complacency, a feeling good about myself. And I can look at myself in relation to other people and I can see that I'm intelligent and all of that stuff. Or I'm wealthy and they're not. Or I'm sane and reasonable, unlike other people. Who's ever had these self-noting kind of human vanity that we bolster ourselves up with and we feel safe and secure? We feel good and we want to keep it that way. We definitely want to keep it that way. And then, guess what is the greatest thing that can disturb that complacency? It's called a wife. Yeah.
That was bad.
Yeah. Or a husband. Right?
Okay.
Okay? Now, this gets very interesting. You see, when we're disturbed, what's actually happened is we're suddenly thrown back on ourselves as we are. Before the disturbance, we were being personality and we were feeling pretty good. Right? And we want that our life to be that way because personality is a defense against fear and self-dissatisfaction. That's what it is. You see, for Swami Dayananda, Western psychologists say that our personality is an adaptation to the environment. Have you all heard that one? For Swami Dayananda, it's an adaptation against fear and self-dissatisfaction. So our personality, the way we are being, is our solution not to even begin to feel self-dissatisfaction or fear. That's why it's so tenacious. So tenacious. But have you noticed that no matter how well our defensive structures are, or how solid they are, every day they seem to assault us in the form of our wife or in the form of our husband in terms of what they say and do. Who's ever noticed that? Now, this is a magnificent opportunity, peoples. This is, believe it or not, it's an opportunity. You see, what happens is, here I am, I'm lost in personality. I'm being myself and I'm feeling smug and I'm thinking life is pretty good and I'm self-objectifying and I like what I'm looking at right now. Who's ever had that self-satisfaction? I like what I'm looking at right now. Am I good or am I good? Right? Now, this is, have you ever wondered why human vanity is so tenacious? It's because it has a defensive function. It frees me, it gives me the experience of being free of all that fear and all that self-hatred. It's fantastic. So what happens is when your wife or your husband says or does something you don't like and you find that, oh, okay, who's ever had that feeling? Who's ever had that feeling? Your actual condition of alienation from God is being revealed. It's only in the presence of the light are you actually revealed as you really are. As you really are. Cut off from God, we're frightened and we're experiencing ourselves and it's lousy. And this is the underlying unconscious dynamic that underlies myself as personality. And now, this is why in order to change, we need as personality to be resolved into the presence of God. Does that make sense? What Swami Dayananda says, resolving in the presence of God. Now, this is how it works. What happens is, here I am, I'm lost in myself. What Dayananda says, we need to do our duties but without losing ourselves. Who's ever had the feeling of just being lost in imagination or lost just no longer alive to facts, but just it's on automatic, right? Now, so suddenly, here's a wonderful opportunity. What happens is my wife says or does something I don't like. Now, if I believe, if the wisdom isn't telling me that the problem is me, centered on me, I will try and change my wife. Isn't that true? And I'll desperately try and change my wife. That shows you how much fear we have. Who's ever desperately tried to make themselves right or win an argument with your spouse? Who's ever done that one? Who's ever done that one? Right? That shows you the intensity of fear that's unconscious, but it's there. So can you see how valuable it would be to be able to resolve the fear and the self-dissatisfaction that drives you to be who you are? All right. Now, so what happens is, now this is where it gets important. You know how he says that the basis of self-acceptance is the understanding of Isvarra. Now he's very clear on this. The basis of understanding of self-acceptance is the understanding of God. Now, so here I am. I can wring Sylvia's neck. Right? Now, this is what I'm feeling. This is what I'm alive to. Right? Now, is the presence of God away from that experience? I want to know, first of all, is it? Absolutely not. Because the light of awareness is showing me that I'm furious and I want to wring Sylvia's neck. Isn't it interesting? Now, the question is, this means that I come to God as I am. I'm actually literally being embraced by this light, and I'm still identified. I'm still caught, and I'm aware that I'm caught and helpless. Who's ever had the awareness that they're caught and helpless? Now, normally we find that a very unpleasant experience. Now, Swami Dayananda said a very interesting thing about emotional states. He says, first of all, don't be afraid of them, and secondly, welcome them. Okay? So here you are, you like this, and you just go, okay, and you're going to remain here like this, and you understand, because your wisdom, spiritual wisdom is telling you that where I encounter God is right here, right now, as I am, and I simply wait. As I am. I don't try and change myself. If let's say that I'm being judgmental and stubborn and completely irrational and unreasonable. Who's ever experienced themselves as that? Then just remain as that unreasonable, irrational person, helpless in it. And what you find is, first of all, even the fact that you're aware that you're upset and that you've fallen away from the lap of God, even that awareness is God's presence. Does that make sense? The very fact that you're aware you've fallen away is the presence of God operating in your life, the wisdom operating in your life. And then what you do is you stay there, and as you stay there, reality penetrates you more, layer by layer, penetrates into you. Now, this is very good. It is good having personality melted. You as personality melted or dispelled by the presence of God. You know, when the sunlight comes in, when you're watching the morning light, and it comes in and the light dispels the darkness, you can appreciate that in yourself. So here you are, you're like that, but what you're doing is you're not escaping, you're not fighting, you're not thinking about it. You are just remaining in the very presence of this light that's showing you that you're like this. And you just simply rest like this. And as you do it, because you're not fighting, what happens is you find yourself drawn more and more into reality. As you're drawn more and more into reality, you're drawn out of that state that you're enclosed in. But you're not doing it. It's been shined away by the presence. Does this make sense? You're not doing it. And then this is what Swami Dayananda means, graceful acceptance. It is born out of our understanding of God. In other words, we're drawn into being accepting. Being accepting. It's not a psychological function, acceptance. It's not something I do. It's a way of being which is born out of our understanding that we, like what John says, because we know by the realization that we're constantly embraced by the presence of God, we don't have to go anywhere. We don't have to become anything. The whole becoming thing ceases. The whole becoming thing ceases. And then we find ourselves in the acceptance. In other words, as we're drawn into reality, you can prove this for yourself. It's not true because I'm saying it. We find ourselves being accepting. Now, Dayananda says in a meditation once, it was really funny. He said, when you're accepting what's in front of you, you find yourself acceptable. When you're refusing or rejecting what's in front of you, guess what? That's the corollary. You find yourself unacceptable. Isn't that funny? So what happens is, the more we work with this, the more we will understand that, actually, I'm always embraced by this light of awareness. And I am what I'm like, right here, right now. I am what I'm like, but I'm no longer now, I am what I'm like, and it's harmful, right? I am what I'm like, but I'm embraced in this light of awareness as I'm like. And that doesn't matter. And when you can remain with yourself as you are without resistance, this is what Swami Dayananda means by self-acceptance. Not accepting a self, making an object and go, yeah, actually, this is looking pretty good. Yeah, okay, I can accept this. Nothing to do with that. All right, that's the Western version, right? Now, so what we're going to do, So we're going to just do a little experiment. It is the most natural thing in the world to be as you are, right? Now, you might think, yeah, but that's a bit boring, or that's not very good, or that's not, it's not very spiritually deep, it's too ordinary and all this stuff, right? What's extraordinary is the presence of reality. Don't worry about the form you're in. You see, when we first come to God like that, we're in the form, aren't we? We're kind of caught up in the form. Then what happens is that we're drawn out of that being that form to simply being rooted in the presence of God, aren't we? Being conscious. And when we're being conscious, we cease to be an object to ourselves. You notice that? We're no longer an object to ourselves. We're simply being. So what I want you to do is we're going to do sort of a little meditation. So we're just going to come back here and we're just going to be aware of the fact that here I am. I'm sitting here. And that's objective because it's happening. I see it. I'm sitting here. There's a certain feel of myself here. I'm aware of that. I'm aware of thoughts and feelings coming and going. But I'm not trying to be aware. I'm not interested in trying to be aware. I just simply want to remain as I am. Then you'll find you'll be aware anyway. I'm just going to remain with myself without that self-dissatisfaction, one part looking at the other part. I'm just going to be with myself as I am. Just quietly being with myself as I am, in the appreciation that I'm embraced by this light of awareness, and this light of awareness is just simply revealing me as what I'm like. And I'm going to relax into this awareness, this light of awareness, as I am. I'm just going to let myself be melted into this light of awareness as it penetrates me, as it reveals me more and more. I don't care. No trying, no thinking, no struggling. Just simply resting in the very presence of this light. We are being lived by the presence of reality. Okay. Now it's a very interesting thing. The Shin Buddhists have and the Hindus have the same thing. There's a difference between a monkey who's holding the baby, and the baby's holding desperately around the mother's neck. So you've got the mother who's holding it, the baby's also holding, right? But then there's a kitten, and a kitten, it doesn't do anything. It just goes limp. It lets itself be carried. It doesn't grab. It's like that. That's a beautiful metaphor. Okay, Kevin, what did you notice when you were just simply remaining with yourself as you were, without thinking about awareness, without thinking about consciousness, and without thinking about the teaching, but just simply being with yourself as you are? What did you notice?
Just a peace and a very refreshing or, beautiful peace, really.
And it was also alive to facts. You weren't in some state of mind. You were peaceful. You were being the peace, weren't you?
Yeah, it didn't matter that there were. I was experiencing a sort of emerging in a depth of peace, and there were thoughts, but they were incidental. They didn't matter.
Yeah. They didn't disturb what you were being. Very good, Kevin. Smita, what did you notice?
I felt peaceful, but I had thoughts coming, but I didn't resist that.
Yep.
So it didn't disturb that quality of peace, and I was very relaxed and at home with myself in spite of the thoughts coming.
And Swami Dayananda thinks the thoughts doesn't matter.
Yeah.
He disbelieved in this idea that the thoughts had to go away. He says, there's consciousness before the thought happened, there's consciousness while the thought's occurring, and then there's consciousness when the thought ends. It's not important what thoughts come and go. That is a major spiritual mistake. People and they think the problem is the mind. When you are being yourself in the face of thoughts coming and going, then that's not a problem. It just doesn't matter what thoughts you're having. It doesn't matter. But when you're trying to make your mind so it doesn't move, your mind's part of the universe. It's going to bloody move. That's just the rule. Yeah. Very good, Smita. Bob Lee.
Yeah, very much. The experience was the sentiment that Kevin described of peace and
So do you notice, Bob? You are always when you pause and think about it, you're always embraced by this light of awareness as you are. As you are. Very good. Andre, the Russian factor.
It's when I stop doing something, all the time I melt and disappear as an object, and I found myself as limitless.
A non-dimensional presence in the form of what is. So you find yourself a non-dimensional presence in the form of trees, tables, chairs, doesn't matter. In other words, there's a unity between the observer and the observer, the subject and object. Then dualism goes, because you're no longer an object to yourself. And did you notice you weren't going to yourself, how am I doing here? Am I succeeding? Am I getting somewhere?
No.
None of that nonsense.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Very, very good, Andre. Michelle.
Well, what's so stunning actually is how easy it is, and how it's always available, and it's good to disappear into just being.
That's exactly right, because your absence as personality is your presence as simple conscious person. And the reason it's easy is you don't have to do this. This is living an understanding. It is not doing something towards an end.
Yeah.
It's living the understanding. Do you know what I mean? Like the Taoists, you know what they say? It's like, you're treading water. So it's active, passive. Do you know what I mean? You're just treading water. And so because you're entrusting yourself to its action, you're sort of being carried. Does that make sense? You're not trying to do anything. Can I say one of the two beautiful things I find within our Western scriptures is, first of all, in him we live, move, and have our being. Beautiful saying. So in him we live, we actually move, like I'm doing things, and I have my being, in him. Beautiful saying. And another one is, God is love. Those who are abiding in love are abiding in God, and God's abiding in them. I never understood that really until I met Dayananda. It took a Hindu monk to teach me. All right? Okay, Amelia.
I was struck by the fullness,
Yep.
first of all, and then the letting go and your instructions not to try, etc., helped with that. This constant letting go and this deepening of the presence of God as you go on.
Quite. And because what happens is when you stop seeking God, he makes his presence felt. Because he's always here. And so when you come like this, as you are, you place yourself in God's hands. That's a metaphoric way of saying it. I find it quite useful. And then you just wait. It's the wisdom that tells you your only refuge is in, if you take refuge in God as exactly what you're like. The great thing about God, Amelia, is he gets down and dirty with us. Does that make sense? You know what I mean? He's not remote. This benevolence is constantly trying to grasp us, or is always grasping us and drawing us to itself. When we understand what God is, so what happens is we find that in our mess, in our upset, in our loneliness, in our despair, that's precisely where we meet the presence of God. It is not when I'm feeling cool, smooth, and extremely spiritually erudite, right? That stops it. Okay, that stops it. Our wisdom's nothing. There's no such thing. In our Western tradition, we're lovers of wisdom because we know it doesn't belong to us. Very good. John.
All right, we were speaking about the difficulty of accepting the whole package, the unconscious moments, the inappropriate actions.
Yeah.
And because I can't accept myself, but in the embrace that we were speaking of, I am acceptable.
Yes, you are accepted. It's given. The acceptability is given. You haven't earned it.
You haven't what?
You haven't earned it. It's freely given.
Freely given. I haven't earned it. That's
No.
right. That's right.
Which is a wonderful thing. So what we've been looking at tonight is I want you during the week to do what Swami Dayananda calls highlighting. What happens is, he says, we might be clear on the vision, but we can forget it. Who's noticed that they can forget it? They can fall away into forgetfulness. So what you can do is you can go, wait a minute, I just want to highlight this understanding here. And this is what he called nididhyasanam, which is contemplation. He says, you see what the words, you know how I've unfolded how he talked about his words. You see the words of the teacher without thinking. You see what the words are referring to without thinking. So the moment you come back and you go, wait a minute, just a minute, here I am, I'm just like I'm like, but even though I'm like this, right now I'm embraced by this presence of the reality in the form of a revealing light. That revealing light has a dynamic effect on me in the sense that it dispels my experience of myself as personality. Dayananda says, very lucky that personality is an experience, because experiences can go away. If personality was reality, we'd be in big trouble. All right? If you were personality, it could never be held in suspension. Okay? The very fact that it can actually fall away means you are not that, even if the tendency is to fall into it and become enclosed in it. So just in our Western tradition, who's ever heard of Brother Lawrence? It was called Practicing the Presence of God. Who's ever heard of him? Right?
Yes.
That dude really understood what I'm talking about here.
Yeah.
Okay? He certainly did. Right? So the whole thing is that, who's ever heard the thing of living a God-centered life? That doesn't mean you're holy and spiritual. I'm not holy and spiritual. I'm far from it. Right? All it means is that we live a God-centered life. To have, in other words, centered on God. So when I'm what Dayananda says, when I'm rooted in Isvarra, I'm no longer rooted in myself. Or when and he says, your problem is you're full of yourself instead of being full of God. A very simple, beautiful way of putting it. So it's a very, once we understand that we're living a vision, living an understanding, or living a wisdom, and the wisdom is given, we are freed from this. It's the most natural thing in the world, just simply to be what you like. Just to be what you like. It's not hard, because you are like what you like, because it's there, you're seeing it. It's objective. So, you're doing the dishes. It's a wonderful opportunity. If, let's say, you're caught in an unpleasant task. Actually, it's not working lately. The dishes have become too pleasant. But the thing is that you start the dishes and you find yourself going, I don't like it, right? Okay, and you go, Now, you don't then go, I shouldn't be bored. No, you go, okay, I'm just going to do the dishes and just continue being what I'm like, because that being what you're like is the revelation of the light of awareness showing you what you're like, and that awareness penetrates you more and more, and as it penetrates you more and more, unravels more and more, you find yourself being light, you find yourself being composed, and then you find yourself being at home with yourself, even though you're doing the bloody dishes. Whereas 2 minutes before, you were resisting. This is what they mean by converting your life into a yoga. It is fantastic when you find yourself being upset, because now you can find your way home. Once you realize you're upset, I've fallen away from the lap of Isvarra. Okay. And then you immediately just remain as you are, and you let yourself be cooked in Isvarra's oven. Okay? And it's the being cooked that changes you, not you. All right. Well, as usual, it's lovely talking to all you guys again. And
thank you.
Look after yourself, and we will see you again next week.